They can't believe you knew everything, not because they believed you incapable, but because your silence never exposed the depth of your awareness. They mistook your lack of reaction as a lack of perception. They whispered in shadows, thinking their venom wouldn't reach you. But what they didn't understand is that some minds aren't built for performance, they're built for precision. And yours watched, yours absorbed, yours traced the hypocrisy in their words like a scalpel through silk. You saw the micro-expressions they didn't control, the tone shifts when the mask slipped. You heard the discrepancies between what they said and what they refused to say. You memorized their games without needing to name them. Your intelligence was never about IQ points. It was about psychological warfare without collateral. You played dumb long enough to watch them decorate their own downfall. What disturbed them wasn't just your awareness. It was the calm with which you carried it. You didn't flinch when the lies grew louder. You didn't chase apologies or demand explanations. You let the room rot in its own deception, because you understood something they never will. There's power in unspoken knowing. A mind like yours doesn't announce. It dismantles from a distance. They tried to provoke, to guilt, to confuse, but your stillness remained. And in that stillness, your intelligence became terrifying. Because nothing is more lethal than a mind that knows, and doesn't need to prove it. You weren't trying to outsmart anyone. You had already won the moment you chose not to expose what you knew. Their entire strategy was built on you being emotionally reactive, but you had transcended the need for revenge. You preferred witnessing their slow collapse under the weight of their own illusions. They can't process it because they played a game assuming you were blind. They built an entire theater around your predicted confusion, and you let them. You applauded their performances. You gave them space to weave their stories. But behind your eyes, a different movie played. You clocked every fake laugh, every transactional compliment, every flicker of contempt behind polite smiles. You knew who was loyal, who was opportunistic, who was positioning themselves for your failure. And yet, you said nothing. Not because you were weak, but because you understood the paradox of power. The one who speaks last often wins loudest. You let their egos inflate. You let them grow reckless. Because when they believe you're unknowing, they expose themselves. And now, they're haunted not by what you said, but by what you didn't. Your silence wasn't compliance, it was surveillance. Your IQ was lethal not because it made you smarter. It made you untouchable. You weren't addicted to being right, you were addicted to being ready. And readiness meant watching without interference. It meant decoding behavior while pretending to be entertained. It meant never letting them know that every interaction was being filed, sorted, analyzed. You weren't just remembering facts. You were constructing profiles. Behavioral psychology wasn't something you read. It became something you lived. You understood the patterns behind their chaos. You studied the way they needed attention, the way their values shifted when eyes were on them. You saw how easily they abandoned people for applause. You noticed how quickly they played victim when power slipped from their hands. And you didn't react, because you weren't after validation. You were after vision, the clearest kind. They underestimated you because you made intelligence look effortless. You weren't the loud voice in the room quoting books. You were the shadow behind the curtain predicting behavior before it surfaced. Your mind wasn't built for applause. It was designed for domination through understanding. You didn't try to fix them. You didn't waste time proving your worth. You let the evidence pile. You let the contradictions build until they formed a noose around their own narratives. And when the reckoning came, it didn't come with anger. It came with exit. You left without explanation, and they've been drowning in the questions ever since. That's the signature of a truly lethal intellect. It doesn't fight for clarity. It becomes the confusion that dismantles fragile egos from within. What scares them most is how little it took to expose them. You didn't need hidden cameras or lengthy arguments. You just needed space. Space to let them talk. Space to let them perform. Space to let them show their hunger for control. And once they revealed themselves, your mind did the rest. It reconstructed timelines. It layered intentions beneath actions. It deconstructed the lies from the truth with surgical precision. You became a one-person tribunal. Judge, jury, and ghost. Not once did you scream your awareness. Not once did you slam the table. You left them with no target, no closure, no apology to reverse their exposure. Your intelligence didn't want to destroy them. It wanted them to self-destruct, and they did, quietly, violently, in their own mirror. You didn't just read people. You read their architecture. You listened to the blueprint behind their behaviors. You understood which ones they masked, which fears they projected, which narratives they depended on to feel worthy. You saw the scared child inside the loudest adult, and you let them believe they were ahead, because knowing is power, but restraint is weaponized power. You weren't interested in being right in front of an audience. You were interested in being irreplaceable in the archives of reality, and now that's where they find you. In every scenario they replay, in every decision they regret, in every silence that stings more than any argument could, you became the echo they can't escape, the variable they failed to factor in, the intellect that unravels narratives with nothing but distance and memory. They said you were too quiet, too passive, too soft. But what they missed was that intellect rarely seeks the spotlight. You don't prove genius, you use it. You don't announce foresight, you employ it. Your strategy was never about outshouting. It was about outlasting. While they were busy plotting short-term wins, you were designing legacy, level understanding. They tried to play chess against someone who carved the board, and now they look at you with awe disguised as resentment, because nothing hurts the ego more than being outsmarted by someone who never needed to brag. You weren't loud, you were lethal, because your understanding wasn't theoretical, it was existential. You understood the nature of the room, the psychology of the performers, and the timeline of collapse. And you timed your withdrawal perfectly. They can't forgive themselves for underestimating you. They saw your grace and called it ignorance. They saw your patience and mistook it for confusion. But your grace was detachment. Your patience was data collection. And when you finally moved, it wasn't revenge, it was revelation. You revealed nothing directly. You left no evidence. Just clarity. You moved on, and in doing so, you burned the illusion they had of control. Your departure was surgical. Your absence felt like exile. And that is what kills them now. The knowledge that they were being watched by someone who already knew the end. That they were laughing at someone who had already decided which bridge to burn, which truth to bury, and which room to never return to again. They can't believe you knew everything. And now, they'll never forget it. You understood the elegance of the unseen. While they played for the crowd, your power moved in silence. While they performed with desperation, you observed with precision. You understood early that true impact doesn't crave visibility, it craves inevitability. And so, you refined yourself in shadows. You sharpened your judgment in silence. You rehearsed your composure not for applause, but for longevity. They wanted to be seen conquering a room. You learned to conquer it by knowing when to vanish from it. The real game was never in who spoke the loudest, but who listened when no one else did. You weren't addicted to presence. You mastered absence, the kind of absence that says more than presence ever could. And now, they talk about you in the spaces you left behind, haunted by the weight of your restraint. They expected you to crave validation. They thought if they withheld attention long enough, you'd beg for it. But you weren't chasing stage lights. You were designing the theater. You didn't need their gaze. You needed your ground. And that's what made your every move lethal. They had to perform to feel powerful. You had to observe to become it. You took the long road, the one paved in reflection, silence, and strategic withdrawal. Because the unseen path isn't about delay. It's about dominance that doesn't ask for permission. You became the force that couldn't be named because you never gave them the language to understand you. You showed no hunger, no desperation, no weakness to exploit. And that mystery, that's what made you unbearable. You didn't react, which meant they had no control. You didn't defend yourself, which meant they had no leverage. You just moved, quietly, gracefully, endlessly forward. Elegance isn't in being watched. It's in being unforgettable without needing to be remembered. You moved like a rumor no one confirmed but everyone feared. You weren't trying to be understood. You were designing silence so sharp it became scripture. They couldn't wrap their minds someone who could see everything and still choose not to strike. That restraint made them unravel, because power in motion can be tracked, but power in stillness becomes mythology. They whispered, "What is he planning?" while you were already 10 moves ahead. Not with fury, not with chaos, but with calibration. Every breath you took was intentional. Every word you didn't say became a sentence they repeated to themselves in the dark. That's what elegance means to someone like you. Not being known, but being felt so deeply they have to reshape their behavior to survive your memory. They built their strength on noise, on being heard, seen, praised. But noise is the currency of the insecure. You dealt in silence, because silence doesn't beg. It just exists, and that made you impossible to control. They couldn't label you, couldn't predict you, couldn't even insult you properly, because you never gave them a response to work with. You refused to enter the arena of emotional theatrics. While they flailed under the spotlight, you became a shadow that suffocated them. You didn't shout. You stared. You didn't chase closure. You embodied consequence, and consequence doesn't perform. It lingers. It haunts. You didn't remove them. You simply became too exact for them to distort. And in that detachment, your silence became scripture. Your withdrawal became legend. To understand the elegance of the unseen is to destroy ego with absence. They didn't realize it while it was happening. They thought they were winning, thought their games were working. But your elegance was never in fighting the obvious. It was in mastering the subtle. You knew exactly what would collapse and when. You timed your disengagement like a final act. You let their fantasy of control build, fatten itself, blind itself. So when the drop came, it wasn't just a fall. It was an erasure. You weren't trying to make a point. You were becoming the point. You embodied an intelligence so composed, so non-reactive, that your very lack of retaliation became the lewdest judgment they ever faced. They stood on stages. You stood in silence. And now, they remember the silence more. You moved like someone who had already grieved the betrayal, already buried the attachment, already accepted the loss before they even tried to damage you. That's the level of calm that can't be mimicked. You didn't carry rage. You carried realization. And realization moves differently. It doesn't scream. It slips under the doorframe and poisons the air of any room your name is mentioned in. They say, "I changed." But what they mean is, "He stopped needing us." You didn't explode. You evaporated. And they still don't know how to fill the space you left behind. Because when you learn to be unseen, you also learn to become unforgettable. Every time they try to reconstruct what happened, they come back to one truth. They were outclassed, not with might, but with silence built from certainty. You didn't need to defend yourself. Your life became the proof. Your stillness became the verdict. You knew they would dig their own graves the moment you stopped interrupting them. And that's the elegance they couldn't predict: strategic detachment. You walked away from their games without explaining the rules you were playing by. And they've been trying to decode the silence ever since. Every attempt to smear your name echoes back with shame. Every effort to replace you feels like dragging a dull knife through memory. Because elegance isn't just style. It's substance that doesn't decay under scrutiny. You were never trying to be impressive. You were trying to be accurate. And now that accuracy slices through every lie they told about you, your elegance was the discipline of invisibility. To choose not to react. To hear every insult, every distortion, every misrepresentation, and to never once give them the satisfaction of a rebuttal. That requires a war-hardened spirit. That demands a self-assurance that doesn't fluctuate with audience reaction. And that's what you built. You taught yourself to disappear from what no longer deserved your presence. Not because you lacked emotion, but because you refused to spend your power where it would be diluted. They called it indifference. But indifference doesn't remember everything with this much clarity. No, what you showed was restraint. And restraint is the scar tissue of true warriors. You weren't hiding. You were rising. And now they must live with the elevation they can't reach. You knew that visibility attracts chaos. That being seen too early invites sabotage. So you waited, refined, became sharper in the dark. That's the secret of the unseen. It's not about hiding. It's about choosing when to appear. You never sought to prove yourself in places built on pretending. You studied, moved in silence, and made sure your absence stung more than their presence ever could. You let your results speak the language they couldn't silence. They wanted you loud, impulsive, predictable. You became quiet, methodical, untouchable. And now, they whisper your name like a prayer they never believed in until the miracles started showing. You didn't rush your revenge. You mastered your rebirth. Because unseen doesn't mean forgotten. It means prepared. There's a poetry in what you did. An unspeakable rhythm to your retreat, to your composure, to the grace with which you let them collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. And now you glide past them like a verdict, not a threat, not an enemy, just undeniable proof that some souls are born to disappear from the chaos and still leave behind a legacy of consequence. You understood the elegance of the unseen, and now so do they.